All right, let's dive right into this. Who really invented rock and roll? It's a question that sparks endless debate, but the actual truth, well, it's way messier and, honestly, a lot more fascinating than the standard textbook mythology. Today, we're looking at the true foundation of modern music, and we're going to uncover who actually built the stage that literally everyone else is standing on.
Welcome to today's Explainer, the anatomy of a rock and roll revolution. We're traveling back to the mid-1950s. This was a time of massive cultural upheaval, and we're going to figure out exactly how a marginalized, frankly dangerous sound infiltrated the absolute center of American pop culture and just completely took over.
Here's our roadmap for today. We've got 5 stops: unmasking the rock myth, the rise of the teenage market, guitars, covers, and crossovers, pioneers and forgotten women, and finally, the architect, Little Richard. Let's get into it.
Part 1. Unmasking the Rock Myth.
So what's really fascinating here is what rock and roll actually wasn't. History books often get this totally wrong. First off, it wasn't a brand new musical style that just magically appeared out of thin air. No way. It wasn't even the first time music was written specifically for young people. Nor was it the first time black and white pop styles mixed in America. So what was it? Well, the crucial takeaway here is that rock and roll was initially introduced primarily as a commercial marketing term. Yeah, it was literally a label designed by the music industry just to identify and sell products to a brand new target demographic.
Which brings us to Part 2, Rise of the Teenage Market.
And man, that new demographic was the true catalyst of this whole revolution, and the numbers absolutely prove it. Just look at this, $514 million. That is the staggering jump in annual U.S. record sales by 1959. To put that into perspective, it was up from just $191 million in 1951. The entertainment industry was absolutely exploding, and it was driven entirely by a brand new, highly lucrative group of young people who suddenly had disposable income in their pockets.
Let's look at who these teenagers actually were. We're talking about the post-World War II baby boomers. They were the very first generation raised with television in the living room, growing up during the relative economic boom of the 1950s, but, and this is a big but, they were living under the constant looming Cold War threat of atomic destruction. So you have this crazy tension. Because of that, they definitely didn't want the polite, conservative Tin Pan Alley music their parents were listening to. They wanted something that contradicted all that. They demanded raw, loud, explicit music. They wanted to rebel, And independent rhythm and blues records gave them exactly the excitement and the danger they were craving.
All right, Part 3. Guitars, covers, and crossovers.
Now, you can't have loud, rebellious music without the right technology to actually amplify it, right? If we trace the evolution of the electric guitar, we see that up through World War II, the acoustic guitar was pretty low volume, mostly used in marginalized musical genres. But then, engineers started experimenting. You see the 1931 Rickenbacker frying pan leading the way for Leo Fender's solid body innovations. We're talking the Broadcaster in '48, the Precision Bass in '51, and the iconic Stratocaster in '54. These instruments could be pushed to provide this dense, sizzling, and incredibly loud sound that was just perfectly designed to drive parents completely nuts. The electric guitar rapidly evolved into the ultimate symbol of energetic diversity, really elbowing its way into the mainstream.
But the mainstream music business in the 1950s, well, it was a really complicated machine. On one hand, you had original R&B artists on independent labels, folks like Big Joe Turner, The Chorts, and Herman Little Jr. Parker. Their music was gritty, it was rooted in the blues, and it was just full of raw, unfiltered energy. But then contrast that with the major labels. They rushed out these sanitized cover versions by white pop artists like Bill Haley, the Crew Cuts, and Elvis Presley. These covers were often balderized, watered-down imitations aimed squarely at cashing in on conservative audiences, all while stripping away the raw, authentic edges of the brilliant originals.
Moving on to Part 4, Pioneers and Forgotten Women.
When we study this era, it is absolutely crucial to look at the key contributors who basically vanished from the charts. Take exceptionally talented women like Wanda Jackson. She was a brilliant rockabilly pioneer who courted major controversy by touring with an integrated band and flat-out refusing to play segregated venues. Then there's Janis Martin. She was literally promoted as the female Elvis by RCA in 1956. But she was immediately dropped and consigned to obscurity the second her pregnancy became public knowledge. Or Lori Collins, who cut these scintillating records for Columbia that somehow never charted. These women were incredible performers, but the extreme political and cultural conservatism of the 1950s severely punished rebellious, empowered women, and ultimately, it just wrote them right out of the textbooks.
And listen, if you were a black female artist, those barriers were exponentially higher. Historical records show it was practically impossible for an empowered black female rocker to break through the mainstream pop charts in the same way the guys did. They faced the heavy dual prejudices of both race and gender. The severe racial segregation and rigid societal expectations of the time meant that, sure, while groups like the Teenage Bobettes had a fleeting hit, by and large, black women were systematically excluded from the early rock and roll narrative.
Now, let's move to our final section, Part 5, The Architect, Little Richard.
All of these cultural forces we've talked about, they perfectly build up to our ultimate case study, Little Richard. I absolutely love this quote from a modern review of his 1957 debut album because it just hits the nail on the head. Quote, "This album is like someone put fireworks in a blender and made you drink it through a flaming saxophone. It's unhinged, holy chaos." When Little Richard burst onto the scene, he didn't just perform songs, he detonated them. It was this raw, explosive energy that fundamentally changed the entire trajectory of popular music.
That 1957 debut album, Here's Little Richard, is just a monumental breakdown of musical norms. It's packed with 12 tracks, and most of them are these sub-3-minute explosions of pure adrenaline. He literally took the shuffle out of traditional boogie-woogie and replaced it with a heavy, pounding piano backbeat. And his voice? He used these raspy, shouted vocals. You know, the famous a-wop, bop, balloon, mop, a lop, bam, boom, treating his voice almost like an additional percussion instrument. These sonic innovations literally paved the way for modern rhythm sections and the high-energy rock we all know today. But here's the thing. His rebellion wasn't just sonic. It was deeply, deeply visual. To really understand his style, we have to look at the zoot suit. This was a 1930s Harlem suit, featuring wide-legged, pegged trousers and a long coat with wide lapels and heavily padded shoulders. When Little Richard performed for white teenage audiences in the super conservative 50s, he often wore slightly oversized jackets and tapered trousers that subtly recalled this iconic piece of African-American jazz history. He was actively rebelling against conservative dress codes by injecting marginalized cultural history directly into mainstream white spaces. And then, of course, there was his unapologetic flamboyance. The pancake makeup, the thin mustache, that towering pompadour, it was all directly inspired by the openly gay blues singer Billy Wright. In a strictly defined 1950s society where gender roles were incredibly rigid, Little Richard just fully embraced cosmetics and gender-defying grooming. He showed exactly how queer culture fundamentally shaped the entire look, feel, and attitude of the rock and roll revolution.
So what exactly is the legacy of the Little Richard blueprint? Well, through his sheer, undeniable charisma, his live performances actually integrated audiences down in the segregated South. Musically, he was literally the teacher. I mean, he personally taught Paul McCartney his distinctive vocalizations. He hired a young Jimi Hendrix to play in his backing band. And his wild energy directly influenced generations of massive icons, from David Bowie and Prince, all the way to Nirvana. He was the originator. He brought marginalized sounds and queer aesthetics to the absolute center of American pop culture.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought for today's explainer. If the true architects of rock, like Little Richard and the brilliant women of rockabilly we talked about, were marginalized, penalized, or had their sound co-opted, who else has history written out? When we look back at pop culture, it is always worth asking who actually built the foundation and who simply got to take the credit.